Hello, and welcome back to the Anthropology podcast. Today, we've got an interview with Professor Helen Ball that I did a few months ago. And we are mostly talking about her book, How Babies Sleep, which was published in 2025, and particularly why it's become a norm to put babies in cots and in their own separate bedroom. So I came across Helen because my doulas actually recommended her book to me and her work. And they said, oh, she's an anthropologist and she works on sleep and all these sorts of things. But I hadn't actually come across her work before. But then I found out that actually she's a colleague of Mike's at Durham. Isn't that right, Mike?
Yeah, and she's just, absolutely amazing person. She's done research on infant sleep for 25 years or something. She's got a little cottage down just by the cricket club in Durham where she's had projects where they've kind of actually observed people sleeping alongside their babies really kind of closely to see how people move around in the night and to look at safety and things like that. And just, she's just a brilliant anthropologist and really excited to hear the episode.
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was very cool about Helen's work is that I could actually see, once I started reading the book, I could see that people had told me things that almost definitely came from her research. They didn't know that they'd come from her research. But for example, the idea that a breastfeeding mum almost always sleeps in a C-curl. So if they co-sleep with their baby, they'll naturally curl around the baby to protect it from the top and the bottom. And so this is one of those sort of facts that reassures mothers that you can co-sleep with your baby and it is safe if you do it properly, no, not pillows and cushions and no, not under the duvet and all this type of thing. And then through reading the book, I found out that that piece of information came about because of Helen setting up cameras in people's bedrooms and literally watching what mothers were doing in their sleep. So this is one of those kind of cool examples of where an anthropologist research has started to sort of trickle down and have an impact in a real way. And then the other thing was a cousin of mine said we'd done kind of completely opposite things with how we decided to treat our babies. And they did the kind of sleep training baby in a cot thing. And I did the co-sleeping thing. But we were constantly talking about it. And because I was having broken sleep for a long time, but I also felt like keeping the baby in the bed was the right thing for me. And my cousin said, well, actually, apparently co-sleeping mums do actually get more sleep than people who have their babies separate. And again, I then found that out as a piece of information in Helen's book. So I thought, oh, wow, she's really, people know stuff as a result of this book and her research, even if they don't necessarily know it came from an anthropologist. Anyway, so I think we'll listen to the episode. Hope you enjoy. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Helen Ball onto the Anthropology podcast today. Maybe you could then start with telling us a bit about your first book, How Babies Sleep. It's so brilliant. And I really wish I had read it in the first year of being a mother because I was doing things sort of differently to the norms around me. And because of that, I was constantly questioning myself. So this book is just so reassuring. And, it's nice to look back and go, oh, I wasn't doing it wrong. But I do think you're very, very sympathetic to all the different challenges that parents face. And I don't think that you are sort of telling people how they should do things or saying that this is the right way. And you're recognizing that there are so many complexities and challenges to it all. So I think you've done a really good job of that. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a bit about how you came to write this book and what your main aims are with it?
So as you said, it's not a how-to book, and I didn't want to write a how-to book. And I've been asked actually 4 or 5 times by publishers to write a book about infant sleep. And specifically, they wanted sort of a parenting book about how to sort of manage infant sleep. And I'd always refused. And I refused because I didn't want to be in a position where people were looking to me for the answers for what they should be doing with their own families. I didn't want to be like some kind of parenting guru. To me, that wasn't interesting, and it wasn't the reality of the research that I've been doing for the last 30 some years. So when I was approached about this one, it was an agent who approached me and said, I've been working with this other author and they've been writing on this topic. And one of the things that keeps coming up when we're promoting the book is, well, how does this apply to parents and babies? And he said, I realized that there was another book here that needed to be written, and it needs to be about the science of how baby sleep works, and then sort of how parents understand that and can they use that to help them with their decision making. And I thought, actually, that is a book that I would enjoy writing. I don't want to write a sort of, you should do this, you should follow these rules and all of that kind of stuff. But I do like talking about the science of baby sleep and all of the research and everything. So that was what made me agree to do it. I did think about it for about 5 or 6 months before I agreed. But I think I was also in a bit of a headspace where I was, I was in my 60s by then. And I was thinking about sort of everything that had happened over my career and how things had changed. And I felt like I wanted to sort of document that process of how things had kind of unfolded research-wise over the years. And then in terms of what my aim is, I think I want people to know what I know. I feel like I've accumulated this vast amount of knowledge about baby sleep, about how parents manage or don't manage, about the things that they think are important, about the strategies that they use, about the ways in which other people undermine them, and I felt as though all of that information shouldn't just disappear with me into retirement. So I wanted other people to have the use of that, whether they find it beneficial or not, that's up to them to decide. But I felt like I wanted it to be out there so that people could use it.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And it is really nicely done. I love the sort of weaving together of different research studies, some of those people who've worked actually with you at Durham, but other research that you're using.
Mhm.
Um, you go right back into the sort of early philosophers of what, John Locke was saying and Rousseau. But then, later in the book, we come to the pros and cons of sleep training and,
Mhm.
and the syndromes. And I thought, oh, I just feel like this book gets better and better. Like every chapter's better, so yeah, and so the next question I've got written down is that I really like the fact that you don't just compare cultures as anthropologists often sometimes do. We sometimes research non-European cultures to highlight what we've taken for granted as normal in Western societies, but you also track changes through history as well, and use the term weird countries, Western
Oh, yeah, weird societies, yeah.
yeah, weird societies, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I thought, that's very interesting. That's kind of one way to sort of group and generalize, I guess a set of norms and practices and beliefs and knowledge structures and everything.
Which we might in anthropology call the global north, I suppose, but people outside of academia don't really understand what the global north is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I think with any of these terms, there's always going to be critiques and
Mm,
limitations
mhm,
and things. But for me, it was a useful way of sort of pointing to what types of factors affect the social norms that maybe become
mhm,
normalized
mhm.
in a society such as this in the UK. So the question is, you bring together history, biology, culture, and anthropology. What inspired you to use this approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in part it was due to the education that I had, um, as, in biology and then in four-field anthropology, etc. And so, I brought all of that with me, and quite a lot of biological anthropologists, I think, use cross-cultural approaches as well to sort of not necessarily benchmark what's going on in human biological variation, but understand the range of diversity in sort of behavioral strategies, maybe behavioral ecology. And so I was used to sort of the idea that you might look at other industrialized non-Western societies as well as non-industrialized societies, etc.
Mm, it's fascinating stuff. So, I'm a social anthropologist, and I was trained in social anthropology. In my department, where I did my PhD in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there were biological anthropologists and archaeologists, but I still kind of didn't really understand what they were. So, could you maybe tell us what a biological anthropologist is, and maybe how it's different to a social anthropologist?
Okay, so the way I would describe myself, or the sort of training that I had as a biological anthropologist, was to think about human diversity and variation from a biological evolutionary lens. So, what is it about our history, our environment, and our culture that has influenced the way in which we live in the world behaviorally, the sort of the behavioral strategies that we might use, the way in which our biology has been shaped, the way in which some of those things manifest themselves as health issues, etc. So I think my perspective has been shaped most strongly, I think, by what we call evolutionary medicine, and the kind of the idea that what we pathologize clinically can sometimes be actually adaptations or habituations or ways in which we have managed to accommodate changes that are a result of our lifestyle, but that we perceive of as being health issues.
Sorry, just to pick up on your use of the word pathologize, do you mean that sometimes things can appear to be sort of essential to us being human, but then what you're showing is that they're not, they're more about the environment? Is that what you mean?
So, in the field in which I work, I suppose we use an evolutionary lens to think about the circumstances in which babies might be vulnerable to sudden unexpected death. So, a clinical perspective on that would be about what are the immediate proximate mechanisms that might cause a baby to die suddenly and unexpectedly. But an evolutionary medicine lens would be, what is it about human babies that causes them to be so vulnerable in the first 2 or 3 months of life? And
Interesting. Yeah.
so it's, it's about all of that stuff that I talked about in the beginning of the book, about why human babies are such helpless baby mammals, and, what is it that we need to understand about what babies can and can't do biologically to be able to take care of them.
Yeah, that makes
That makes
absolute
sense?
sense. Yeah, no, definitely. And so it's kind of yeah, those elements that can be considered universal that are there as part of our biology, wherever we are, whatever culture and society or time in history or
Absolutely. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah.
And
So
then, yeah.
in the beginning of the book, you explain that we are precocial mammals. Remind me what that means again.
So it basically means animals that have been, or mammals that are born after a relatively long gestation and are well developed at birth. So they can
Ah,
see,
okay.
hear, call, walk, follow their mums, cling, all that stuff.
Okay, and we're those types.
Or most of our characteristics are those types, but we can't walk and cling.
Yeah, and we still take quite a long time after birth to get brain development and all sorts of other things, isn't it?
So, yeah, we can't coordinate our limbs when we're born. It takes a long time for all of those sort of neurological control mechanisms to come on stream. And that makes us uniquely vulnerable in those first few months of life, and uniquely needy, which is one of the things that our parents struggle with.
Mm. Yeah, actually, that part of your book reminded me of another book written by a neuroscientist called The Nurturance Revolution, and
Is that Greer, Kirchenbaum?
yeah, and she sort of similarly explains that it's really vital for like human babies to have lots of physical touch and comfort to help all of our neurological pathways and things like this and brain development. And I think you make a sort of similar argument in the beginning that at some point people thought human babies sort of just need food, but actually there are these studies that showed that the comfort of a person is, also very, very important.
Very important. Yeah.
And there were
Yeah.
two different sort of studies I think you use. There's one that was with a baby monkey who is given a model that's either one that's kind of a very stark model and there's sort of no interaction between them. And then there's a one that's got sort of a bit of fur and a bit of fluffy. And so then the baby monkey responded better to the slightly fluffy model, wasn't it?
So it was testing Freud's theory that the attachment between a mother and the baby is because the mother provides the baby with food.
Right.
And the outcome of the experiments was that it's not the food that the baby's attached to the mother for, it is the comfort and the contact. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I thought that was so interesting. And then there was another study used afterwards that's about,
Was this Bowlby's work? Yeah.
yeah, it was about parenting and maybe institutions, or the impact of children in institutions and the lack of parenting versus having some parenting, even if it's not sort of perfect.
Perfect parenting, yeah. So they were having their physical needs met. They were being kept clean and they were being fed, but they got no interaction from adults because there were just hundreds of children lined up in cots. He was writing a report about the institutional care of children and how children needed not just to be fed and watered, if you like, but they actually needed love, that love and contact was really important for child development.
I mean, that's one of those things where you go, wow, I mean, isn't that obvious? But
Mhm.
somehow it
Yeah,
became not obvious at some point in
yeah,
your own
yeah.
history. I wonder whether that's sort of, the sort of dualism of mind and body and everything becomes about rationality and the Enlightenment.
Well, I think that there were two things that kind of like went on. One was about wanting future cannon fodder um, in that era, that they wanted soldiers who were kind of strong and healthy and could go and fight in all of these wars and around the empire and all of that kind of stuff. But before that, um, it was about the religious order. It was about, children being obedient and um, listening to their parents and doing as they were told and not being any trouble to anybody. And, it was like bringing up children to conform to a particular worldview, a particular ideology.
But also we can see it very clearly today is like these ideas might be historical, but they still have such resonance today.
They
And
really do. They've got really long reach and they're sort of embedded in a lot of the cultural attitudes that people still sort of adhere to. I mean, maybe not, maybe they don't consciously adhere to them. I think they've become sort of unconsciously embedded in our national psyche somehow, that, our children behave like this and we won't mollycoddle them and we won't make them clingy and dependent and all of those things, because that's not the kind of humans we want in our society.
it's fascinating stuff. So one of the things I really liked in that sort of early part of the book is about the cot, and
Mm.
you explain that there's a moment where basically women are pressured to put their babies in cots because they were opening up and confessing in the Catholic Church. I can't remember if it was in Italy.
Mhm.
Um, and saying that, God, I'm having my eighth child and I've actually smothered it because I don't want to have any more children. And so the priests start getting a bit freaked out and say, we need to
Mhm.
stop mothers sleep with their children.
Yeah, this really was the Catholic Church, and it was mostly in mainland Europe rather than in the UK. But yes, because of the lack of birth control in that era, it was like when you've got enough children or too many children that you can't really feed anymore, how do you control your family size? And the easiest way to control your family size is to smother them in the night and claim that it was an accident. And that's what was happening. And it's it's not a fun thing to think of happening to a baby, but it was reality. It was everyday reality for millions of women who just were kept having to churn out babies because they had no way of stopping that from happening.
Mm.
Um, and then yes, when they confessed, this was like a moral outrage for the clergy. They couldn't condone it, so therefore then felt they had to do something about it, and encouraging mothers to start. So I think things like cradles had probably been around for a long, long time, because all cultures have got some way of being able to put their baby down in a safe place and leave them if they need to do something. Um, and if you think about, cradle boards and hammocks and, all the different ways in which women park their babies when they are trying to do work or, grow crops or processed food or whatever, or strapping them to their bodies or their backs or whatever. In Western Europe, the tradition had evolved of using cradles that you could put on the floor.
Mm.
And so those got pressed into service as nighttime receptacles for babies as well as daytime receptacles. And so women then who, because if they had an option, if they, they didn't have to sleep with their baby because there was this thing available where they could put their baby, then if the baby died in the bed, it must be her fault. She must have done it deliberately
Ah, I see.
because she didn't have to sleep with it because there was somewhere else for the baby to sleep. And this
Mm.
is when the whole idea of bed sharing and co-sleeping started to get demonized, and mothers' bodies became, characterized as weapons
Wow.
that were lethal for their children.
Wow. And so can you give us like a rough era, like of dates around, what sort of time are we talking about when this started happening?
I think this was like 16th, 17th century type stuff. And then as it came into the 18th century, you started to get wealthy people who could afford to build larger houses, starting to then separate sleeping areas. So, in the 15th, 16th century, everybody slept in the same room, and that was usually the kitchen.
Mm.
And there was just, the main room of the house. And then the sort of the private bedrooms started appearing a bit later than that in the the more wealthy classes.
Mm.
And then, children were expected to start to sleep alone. And those people who could afford to have servants, of course, the babies didn't sleep with the mothers at all. They slept with the nursemaids.
So in the book, you talk about the cot and the social history of the cots, and then I was watching a video of you talking on another program, and in there you were saying that actually it's funny because we've ended up sort of creating nests for our babies, when actually the type of mammal we are, that's not normally what we would do.
Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So if we think about altricial and precocial mammals, the ones that spend their early infancy in nests are the altricial ones, and they have a relatively short gestation period, and then they're born in this sort of quite undeveloped state, and so they're hairless, they're blind, they can't hear. So if you think of things like mice, hamsters, kittens, puppies, those sort of animals that have litters. So mums prepare a nest. They have the babies in the nest, and there's many of them, and they keep each other warm, and they stay in the nest to be safe. And the mom just leaves them for long periods and goes off and forages. And of course, she's got many babies to feed, and they're growing rapidly. So she has to eat a lot to be able to produce enough milk to satiate them. And the milk that she produces is high in fat. Um, and that keeps them going in those long periods that she's absent. Whereas the other type of mammals, the precocial mammals that have the longer gestation period and are more well developed when they're born, if you look at their milk, it's low in fat, doesn't satiate babies for long periods, um, because they're feeding frequently, and it's high in sugar, and they need the sugar to be active. So they're kind of like following their mums or clinging to their mums. And then we fit into that precocial category. We've got our babies are born one at a time, and they've got their eyes open, and they can call and all of that when they're born, but they just can't cling or walk, which is to do with our brains not being anywhere near as close to adult development when we're born. And that's because we ultimately have these massively huge brains. And it takes us an entire year to mostly grow it. Um, and but our milk is the same as the milk of other precocial mammals. It's low in fat and it's high in sugar. And what human babies are doing is using the sugar to grow their brains, because it's a very energetically expensive organ. But they can't stay close to their mums to feed frequently, so we have to keep them in close proximity. But the way in which we've sort of encouraged separation between mother and baby in the newborn period in Western societies or weird societies is by the use of the cot. and the idea that you can put a newborn down and they're going to be happy to stay there for a prolonged period until the mum comes back and retrieves them, however long that's going to be, which obviously they have no idea how long that's going to be. So they're sort of innately programmed to try to maintain close proximity as much as they can, which is why they have this wah, wah, wah cry, which is really like it's like other animals' separation distress call. Um, and, we use the cot as sort of as if it's a nest, and mothers often are told off for trying to kind of like make it comfy and cozy and snuggly for a newborn, etc., which kind of like increases the chance of suffocation and all those sorts of things. So we were never meant to put our babies down in these sort of artificial nests. We were supposed to keep them as close to us as we can, which is, why in many cultures they're carried in wraps and slings and, other devices that people have fashioned to kind of like strap their babies to their bodies. But of course, in Western societies, we've lost all of that
Mm.
for various historical reasons.
Yeah, and I remember seeing something about how children in some Aboriginal communities apparently don't cry when they're babies because there's always someone to hold them. They're very rarely in contact with somebody.
Yeah, crying is less common. It is not that they don't cry, but
Mm.
they cry a lot less when they're in communities where contact is the norm. Even
Yeah.
I mean, and even in our society, when we did work with white British and Pakistani families in Bradford, the Pakistani mums would always say, or we would say, where does your baby sleep during the day? And the white British mums were almost always, well, upstairs in their cot. And the Pakistani mums were like, well, here, where we are.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, do you put them down somewhere? And they're like, no, somebody holds them. Somebody's always holding them. And that's where they sleep during the day.
Yeah.
Different ideas about how you take care of babies.
Yeah, and so much attached to our economies and value
Hmm.
and what we value and why and all those things. So, as I said before, I think you do a good job of making it clear that you're not trying to tell people how to do things. You're trying to get people to question things. But one of the things that I've kind of thought throughout my journey and thinking about my friends' experiences and things is that I have been woken up every 2 or 3 hours for the last 2 years and 4 months. And sometimes it does have a significant effect, and sometimes I'm very tired, and it has put strains on my relationships and all the things that you talk about towards the end of your book about the impact of sleep deprivation. So you do take sleep deprivation very seriously and recognize it can have, real consequences and create all sorts of dangers. Um, but do you think that essentially is it a privilege to be able to make such decisions that, I'm going to have my baby in the bed with me and I'm going to let them wake me up when they need to because I think that's best for them. And, maybe it's good for me too because I'm going to get sleep, but it's kind of broken sleep. From my observations, a lot of the people who've made the decisions to put the baby in the cot in another room and do the sleep training are the women who've also had to go out to work, and had to be up in the morning,
The best.
and feel as though that they needed their kind of brain capacity to be able to function and they couldn't afford to have their sleep broken. So is it a privilege to be able to make that sort of decision to have the baby in the bed?
I think I would push back on that assumption that a parent sacrificing their sleep to breastfeed and bed share. Um, Because I think from the vast majority of women that I've interviewed about why they bring their baby into bed, it's because it's what makes night times as easy as they can make it. It's the strategy for getting the most sleep in their situation. So given that the kind of baby that they have, and maybe it's a function of the baby's temperament that some people can put their baby down and leave them for a prolonged period and they don't kind of like make a fuss about it. And other babies are much more kind of like protesting of that. And if you've got a protesting baby, what are you going to do? You're going to get a lot less sleep if if you keep trying to put your baby in the cot and they keep screaming, you have to pick them up and then try and put them in the cot again. If you just lie next to them, you all get a lot more sleep. So I think, I don't think it's a privilege to be able to do that. I think it's a strategy that people use given the kind of baby that they have and their own temperament in terms of what they can and can't put up with. So some people just can't abide to hear their baby cry, whereas other people can't abide to feel their body is kind of like constantly touched out.
Yeah.
So I just think there are different ways of dealing with the same, they're on a continuum. And they're the two extremes, putting your baby in a cot and leaving it to scream, or bringing your baby into bed and letting it breastfeed all night, are just the, two ends of strategies that people actually, I think, no, I don't think, I know, people actually move along that continuum to different points during the course of their baby's first year. So I don't think these are fixed endpoints. You either do one or you do the other. People might start off doing one, figure out that doesn't work for them, switch to something else.
Wow.
Change strategies again as their babies get a bit older, don't need to feed as frequently or whatever. But I do think that doing some of those things at both ends gets demonized. And there's still that sort of puritanical or Catholic idea that you're either going to kill your baby or you're mollycoddling your baby, but either way you're doing something wrong. So I don't think either group kind of like gets away from being told they're doing something wrong. I think everybody's criticized no matter what they do.
Yeah. But one of the things that really hit home is that the mothers who bring the baby into the bed and breastfeed in the very first few days and weeks, actually there's a greater continuation of breastfeeding duration for much longer. Is that
There
correct?
is. Yeah. And there's different interpretations of this. So biologically, if you're able to keep your baby close to you and feed frequently during the day and the night in the first 2 or 3 days, it triggers your prolactin levels to kind of hit the threshold when your copious milk production starts quicker. So, your prolactin isn't falling back down to zero every time you feed. You feed again before it's completely dropped. So each time you feed, it's climbing a little bit further. So you hit this threshold for prolactin, and your lactogenesis 2, kind of like copious milk production, your boobs get rock hard and really hot. But then that you can feed your baby. You've like got lots of milk and you feel confident in your ability to feed them, etc. If you're separated, in the kind of circumstances where babies are taken away from mums at night in the hospital, or they've had a C-section and they can't physically keep getting their baby out of that bassinet at their bedside, they tend not to feed anywhere near as frequently. And so after 3 or 4 days, their milk's still not come in. And then when it does come in, it's not very prolific. And they question their ability to feed their baby and they don't trust their bodies. And, all of these things kind of like undermine women's ability to breastfeed, but they often don't know that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
So that, there's evidence from some of the studies that we did in the 2000s that if you keep mothers and babies in physical contact on the postnatal ward, more of them will keep breastfeeding for longer than if you separate them. And then when they go home, if they bed share, they're also more likely to still be breastfeeding at 6 months than the ones who went home and didn't bed share. But the second part of that, with what happens at home, might also be because those who have the strongest intention to breastfeed are more likely to bed share.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another thing that's so fascinating about the book is that, you don't really have any conclusions in there that are just, your opinions or theories or other people's theories. Everything is pretty much backed up by studies. So one of my questions was, have you received any backlash from parents who feel guilty or criticized by your book? As a follow-up question, why do you think guilt is such a common emotion amongst parents in the West?
Mm.
Why are we always feeling guilty, whatever we do?
I think it's definitely a social construction, this motherhood guilt. My instinct is that we create it ourselves. Nobody's wagging their finger at you and saying you're doing the wrong thing. I think we're questioning our own choices, but not feeling as though we can actually do anything in a different way. I mean, people do sometimes, yeah, I've had people, not directly to my face. They haven't said, your book, you made me feel. But I have read reviews and things where people have said, this just made me feel guilty about the way in which I parented. And it's like, why? Why does reading about the way biology works? We've got this motherhood myth, haven't we, that mothers should be all nurturing, all self-sacrificing, all of this. I talk a lot about parent-infant conflict
Yeah.
and mothers having to make difficult choices about how much investment they are going to put in each particular child. And we all choose to invest in different ways. And that might be physically, it might be emotionally, it might be economically, it might be in a whole load of different ways.
That part, it's coming towards the end of the book. I think it's even chapter 9 where you're starting to talk about the parent-infant conflict. I think it's really interesting, and even reading that is a relief. And another question or a sort of observation I made was that it seemed like that for most people I knew, the choice they were making, even though they didn't say it explicitly, was it's more important to me to have my husband in my bed than the fact that, my children might want to be in my bed. And it was really nice reading that study about the English mothers in Bradford and the Pakistani mothers, and, the Pakistani mothers saying, oh, well, the fathers understand, it's just a baby, that's why the baby's in the bed. Um, but, thinking about my research in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, it's now kind of increasingly normal for husbands and wives to sleep together. But, for a very long time, men slept in the men's houses and women sleep
Sure.
in the men's
Hmm.
houses with the children. So even the notion that we have them husband and wife in a bed in itself is a kind of social construct. Where does that come from, and
Of course it is. Yeah.
why does that have value as is something
Why
that's
is it? Yeah. Why is it so important? Yeah.
yeah. So I love the fact that, the book sort of says to us, we are mammals, we are part of nature, whether we like it or not, doesn't matter how many iPads we have, if you do your breastfeeding, you will do this instinctive thing that's just part of the type
Yeah.
of animal that we are, and it's such an important reminder of that. But yeah, but people are making these kind of choices all the time, and these are so social and cultural, aren't they?
And economic too, aren't they? I mean, a lot of it is driven by people's economic circumstances and their need to go back to work as soon as they can. And the society that we have created, where families are fragmented and people are trying to parent in isolation,
Mm.
I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why the mother-father bond has become so vital, is because if you lose that, who have you got?
Yeah, I really think that's a very, very good point. I think you're right. It's the mother father who are the fundamental parenting community now.
Yeah. Whereas previously, or in other societies, it was lineages of women. It was mothers and sisters,
Mm.
grandmothers, aunts.
Yeah, fascinating. So, have you thought about, or do you think about, what sorts of policies or, economic changes or societal changes you think would be necessary to facilitate more normalization of breastfeeding, bed sharing, allo parenting, collective parenting?
Uh-huh.
What would we need to do to be able to make all of these things norms again, for the benefit of ourselves, our own mental health, and for our children?
I have an aspirational example. I have a PhD student who is doing research on toddler sleep in the Czech Republic, and she has recently had her third child. And there, they get 3 years parental leave. And, that is just such a gift, isn't it? To get some kind of, social support for 3 whole years while your child is in this highly dependent phase of their lives.
Mm.
And then I think the other thing that we can individually think about, and actually, as I've thought about it, I think we are moving in this direction. And that is that certainly when I was growing up, the aspirations that I was encouraged to have, educationally and personally, were to leave home as soon as possible, go as far away as I wanted to, and pursue whatever dream I want. And I could have any career I wanted. And if I just worked hard enough, I could go wherever and do whatever.
Wow.
And I think that perspective propelled quite a lot of us a long way from our family homes.
Yeah.
And so we've ended up parenting in far-flung places with absolutely no sort of family support.
Mm.
And I talked to both my daughters about that as they were growing up, because I felt completely unsupported as a mother
Mm.
and wished that I had thought sooner about how far away from my family I was going to end up at the time that I had my children. So I've talked to my own daughters about it, and both of them made a decision that they weren't even going to apply to universities that were further south than Leeds and York.
Mm.
They didn't even want to consider going more than a couple of 100 miles away, or, an hour and a half train journey or something.
Yeah.
But I think now, we're seeing more and more students not going away from home for university because they can't afford it. And we're seeing more and more young adults living at home because they can't afford to get houses. And so that sort of aspirational move away as far from your parents as you possibly can is sort of changing.
Mm.
And that might make things better for them in the long run. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the other thing is that, in all of our choices, there are sacrifices, isn't it? Sometimes you have to
Mhm.
sacrifice the career or the dream career and take a sort of slightly different version of it and choose the support network, or you follow the dream, but you don't have the kids. I remember years ago, people were talking about green wages, and the idea was that you aim for full employment, but everybody works a 4-day week or a 3.5-day week.
Mm.
Basically, every job is split in two. So you have two people doing every job. Everybody's got a job, but everybody's working half the amount of time. And then the sort of benefit of that is that you then can have, significantly more flexibility, but you can also have two parents both working and being at home with the children.
Mhm.
And so you're having the same output in an economy as you're having with, some people being in full-time employment and some people being out of employment.
Mm. Employment.
And everyone has a better off, way of life. Why not? But no, the government wants to make sure we are all in work, and they'll only give us
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
if we are both in work. I think it's
Yeah.
absolute madness. There's sort of no thought about the importance of nurturance or parental trial
Mhm.
in our policies at the moment. And if you read
Mhm.
the Nurturance Revolution or your book, you recognize these are very, very important things. And I think one other thought I was having whilst you were talking is that, I think one of the reasons I know, people in my generation do like to be far away from their families is because there's lots of sort of toxic, unhealthy dynamics in their families, and they actually don't really want to, be in contact with those sort of things all the time. There's a lot of estrangement, in weird
Mm. Mm.
families. And you sort of think, well, does that come back down to these trends of 150 years ago, where there wasn't, a baby wasn't allowed more than a kiss on the forehead, it wasn't given a
Yeah.
cuddle, it
Yeah.
wasn't responded to when it was crying, it was left for, 6 hours at a time at nighttime because some man in New Zealand said it should have been. And so what are the consequences of these things? And the more you read, you realize that the 0 to 3 years is how the brain is basically structured for the rest of its life. Whatever happens in those very first years, become incredibly difficult to change later on in life. So science and logic would show that we should be throwing everything into the 0 to 3, making that the absolute priority, and that we would
Yeah.
have nicer, happier, more social, more communal, healthier people, having better relationships, having more emotional intelligence, and probably not a bunch of psychopathic narcissists running the world, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that's my conclusion from the stuff I read and mothering.
Well, I really can't disagree with you on any of that. Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
So, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for writing the book. I'm really glad you did. I heard you say on another program that you'd been doing research on all these things and you thought, well, I just need to keep doing the research. But, thank God you did put all of your research together in one book, and you've done it in a way that's really accessible and interesting and very sympathetic. And I think it's a very balanced book. I think you've done a good job of not sort of trying to push anybody in any direction.
Thank
And
you.
it's, yeah, been really lovely to talk to you about it.
You too. It was a nice conversation. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this interview and want to hear more perspectives from the world of anthropology, head over to our website, theanthropologypodcast.com, for more episodes. You can also check out our socials at the AnthPod. Thanks for listening to the Anthropology Podcast this week, and until next time, take care of yourselves and those around you.